Here we're going to cover the controls over energy flow through ecosystems. Plant production places an upper limit to the energy flow through both plant-based and detritus-based webs. So when we want to take a look at what's possible as far as energy flow to higher trophic levels, we have to start with plant production, and that represents the upper limit. So if we were to draw out how much NPP there is, for example, and then take a look at how much herbivory there is, or consumption by herbivores, across a gradient of NPP, that upper limit is to herbivore consumption is going to be based on NPP. Now, whether a particular ecosystem falls on the line or below the line is an interesting question. But to begin with, we're going to start with some of the bottom-up controls over herbivory and ecosystems. This is figure 10.4, and it shows the log-log relationships between, on the x-axis, above ground NPP. So here's ANPP on the x-axis. And you can see this is a log scale, 100 kilojoules per meter squared per year, 1,000, 10,000, and 100,000. And in terms of converting kilojoules to grams, if you're to divide this by 20, you would get grams. So we're talking about somewhere on the order of 5 grams, 50, 500, 5,000. So that's a scale that we might be a little bit more used to as far as productivity is concerned. And here's herbivore biomass, kilojoules per meter squared per year. You can see that when this is 100 on the kilojoule side of things, and let me go back to kilojoules, that the relationship is on the order of 1, 2, 3 orders of magnitude less. Here we're at 10,000, and this is 10, and again, that's a 1,000-fold difference. So we're looking at 1,000-fold less biomass of herbivores than there is ANPP. When we look across these ecosystems, deserts, tundra, grassland, savanna, and forest, there's a pretty good relationship across these ecosystems at least, as far as how much herbivore biomass you have. In addition, when we take a look at grasslands, on the x-axis, here's ANPP, and this is going to be a little bit more difficult because it's log of kilojoules per meter squared per year. So at 3, we're at 1,000 kilojoules, and at 4, we're at 10,000. So here we're going to take a look at that relationship between herbivore biomass, in this case it's really just mammals that we're talking about, and ANPP for natural grasslands and managed grasslands. And you can see the slope of these two relationships are pretty similar, and we have a greater amount of herbivore biomass in a managed grassland than a natural grassland for a given amount of ANPP. The difference here is somewhere on the order of 1 order of magnitude. So we're seeing 10 times more herbivore biomass in a managed grassland than a natural grassland. So these are all grasslands in South America. And essentially the question is, why are these managed grasslands, why do they have 10 times more herbivore biomass than the natural grasslands, for example? Well, there's a couple things here. By stocking with cattle in South America, we're replacing organisms that are no longer present in the natural grasslands. There aren't large herbivores like cattle that are often in natural grasslands. And then in the managed grasslands, the managers are going to control for predation and parasitism and disease and provide supplemental drinking water and minerals. All of this allows a greater proportion of ANPP to enter into the herbivores than in a natural grassland. So if we were to compare for a given amount of production in a managed system versus a natural system, at least in these South American grasslands, we'd have 10 times more herbivore biomass in the managed system than in the natural system because of all the things that managers do to allow a greater proportion of that net primary productivity to be consumed. Now, when we take a look at the upper bound of this relationship between, say, NPP in herbivores. We say that it's NPP that determines the upper bound for herbivores. But often if you go to a site and you measure the NPP, you'll find sites that are going to have a lot more herbivores than you would have expected based on what this upper bound should be. And in those cases, there's often subsidies of energy into that ecosystem beyond what the net primary productivity of that ecosystem is. Subsidies are a way of thinking about material that enters into the ecosystem. And the term that we use for organic matter that comes into the ecosystem from outside of the boundaries that we draw is allochthonous. And this is material that's produced from outside the system that then enters into the system. That's allochthonous material. In contrast to allochthonous material, we have autochthonous material, and that's material that's produced within the system. So in some systems, you can have allochthonous material that enters into the system and boosts the quantity of herbivores that you have in that system. So if we're thinking about a grazing model, for example, the importation of grass, of hay, for example, is the introduction of allochthonous material. But in other systems, like aquatic systems, for example, you can have allochthonous material from outside of the ecosystem enter that ecosystem and boost productivity. So leaves falling into a stream, if we think of the stream as an ecosystem, the leaves entering into the stream are allochthonous. Now, in the end, when we take a look across ecosystems, there's a 1,000-fold variation in the quantity of material that's consumed by herbivores. That's a lot of variation, and a lot of that is due to differences in primary productivity. But biome differences in herbivory reflect more than just differences in NPP. There's also differences in nutrient balance and plant allocation to these defenses that really can alter your productivity. So if this is our line, here's NPP, and this is herbivores, we can have systems where almost all of that material is going to be consumed, but then have systems where it's a lot less for a given amount of NPP. And sometimes the nutrient balances aren't right for herbivores, and it doesn't allow them to eat a higher proportion of NPP. And in other cases, that there's structural and chemical defenses that prevent plants from being consumed by herbivores. Now, often throughout the book, and what we talk about here, is we think about the transfers of energy. And that's often a primary currency that's used to categorize trophic transfers. But plants are eaten for more than just energy. As we talked about, animals need nutrients too, and they often get them from plants exclusively. And so the nutrient to energy ratios, or the content of nutrients within plants, are important for understanding which plants are eaten and how much plant gets consumed. So for example, ruminants, such as cattle or bison, need to ingest material that is about 1% nitrogen. If the concentrations of nitrogen in plants are too low, for example, so instead of being up here, they might be here for how much nitrogen you have, ruminants cannot make up for low quality material by eating a larger quantity of material. So they need to have things that are about 1% nitrogen in order to generate the protein in their digestive system to grow. If most of the plants on the landscape on average are less than 1% nitrogen, in essence, ruminants can't consume them and put on body mass. So that's a situation where the ratio of nutrient concentrations to energy concentrations are important for determining how much material gets eaten and how much herbivore biomass you can produce. In addition, plant chemical and physical defenses reduce the proportion of energy transferred to herbivores. So one example here, if we take a look across ecosystems, we can take a look at ANPP, so above ground net primary productivity, and this is kilojoules per meter squared per year. And again, divide this by 20 to get to grams per meter squared roughly. We can take a look at ANPP, and we can also just take a look at foliage production. And what that does, if we do that, forests can have high NPP, but a lot of that NPP is actually in relatively inedible wood. So if we go across ecosystems and we take a look at the relationship between herbivore biomass and ANPP, that in forests, you can see that often there's a lot less herbivory that happens or a lot less herbivore biomass than you would have expected just based on AMPP. If all of that was potentially consumable, you'd expect somewhere on the order of 10 to almost 100 times more herbivore biomass. But if we take a look at the relationship between foliage production and consumption by herbivores, these forests are falling a lot closer to that line. And so the line that's determined by these other systems, deserts, tundra, grasslands, for example. And so thinking about what the upper bound is isn't often best set by how much AMPP there is, but how much consumable AMPP there is, such as foliage production. As we've talked, it's not just the quantity of food produced, it's the quality. And some of those quality aspects are the nitrogen concentration, so how much protein there's going to be in food, and also how much, on a macro scale, how much of that food is going to be high quality or low quality, and high quality being leaves versus wood. And we have to think about how much of that food is being produced, what the quantity is, but also the quality of it beyond just nitrogen concentrations. Because a lot of plants are defended with different kinds of defenses, and we tend to divide defenses up into two classes based on whether they contain nitrogen or not. The ones that do not contain nitrogen we think of as carbon-based defenses. And these defenses primarily are there to reduce the availability of limiting resources to plants. So something like tannins are a good example of a carbon-based defense. What tannins do is they bind to protein. So if you were to drink black coffee or red wine, or find an acorn and bite into it, there's going to be a large amount of tannins that are there, and they bind to proteins relatively well. And often when you drink or eat these substances, your tongue will feel really cottony. And what that is actually the tannins from those food sources binding to the proteins on your tongue. The same thing happens in the digestive system, where protein binds with the tannins and can be made unavailable to herbivores. So this is an example of what we call a carbon-based defense, reducing the availability of a limiting resource, in this case protein. Now there's also another class of defenses, and here we're going to talk about them as nitrogen-based, and these still contain carbon, but they often contain nitrogen. Whereas the other ones work more on a quantitative basis, they're present in plants in a large quantity. The nitrogen-based defenses are often there on a lower quantity, but they're a lot more active. Nitrogen-based defenses tend to be toxic, and whereas carbon-based defenses reduce the availability of limiting resources, these nitrogen-based defenses actually affect different systems within the animal. So the nervous system, for example, or some other functions such as the liver or the heart. So we think about alkaloids, for example. These are ones that can be very toxic in small quantities, and they contain nitrogen. So if we take a look at those factors that are going to reduce how much herbivory there is and how much herbivore biomass is on a landscape. So here we have AMPP, and here we're going to have herbivore biomass. That this is an upper bound based on 100% transfer of all of the primary production into herbivores. And the intercept of this line, or what fraction of biomass can be used to support herbivores, is something we'll get at another time. But thinking about what brings ecosystems below that line, less herbivores then are potentially being supported by total primary production. Part of that has to do with the availability of different nutrients within plants, but also there's different defenses. So there's a whole host of reasons why plants are not eaten, and some of those has to do with the type of plants that are there. If there's too much wood, for example, or the protein concentrations are too low, there's energy that's present, but they really can't be utilized by herbivores. Also, if those plants have mixed in with their proteins and with their energy secondary compounds, they're going to taste bad, they're going to reduce the digestibility of food, and also have potentially toxic effects in the right quantities. All of these need to be considered when asking how much herbivory there is and how much herbivore you see on a landscape.